In 1954, a woman in Cincinnati skipped her nightly beauty routine for a single week. By Friday, her husband had mentioned it to the pastor. By Sunday, her mother-in-law had called. And by the following Monday, her employer, a woman herself, had quietly asked whether everything was all right at home. That single anecdote, documented in the letters column of a 1954 issue of McCall's magazine, says everything you need to know about what happened to your face and your entire social architecture when you dared to go to bed without cold cream. But before we get to the social catastrophe, let us begin with the physical one. Because the truth about skipping your beauty routine in 1954 was not merely that you looked tired. The truth was chemical. It was environmental. It was, in the most literal sense, written on your skin by the very air you breathed. Post-war American cities were extraordinary places. They were also extraordinarily toxic ones. The industrial expansion that had powered the Allied victory had left behind a legacy of particulate matter hanging in permanent suspension over every major metropolitan area, from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles. The coal-burning furnaces, the automobile exhaust, the factory emissions, all of it settled every single day onto the faces of women who walked through those streets. Researchers at the American Dermatological Society had begun documenting what they were calling accelerated urban aging as early as 1952. Their conclusion was stark. Women who removed that particulate layer every evening and replenished the skin's protective barrier were measurably outpacing their non-cleansing counterparts in skin quality by the time they reached their mid-40s. Skipping the nightly ritual was not vanity. It was, according to the science of the moment, a genuine physiological decision with compounding consequences. And the cosmetics industry knew it. They had known it for decades, and by 1954 they had built an empire on that knowledge. The cold cream ritual that most American women practiced in 1954 was not a single product applied in a single gesture. It was a multi-stage ceremony that could take anywhere from 20 minutes to the better part of an hour, depending on how thoroughly one's day had been spent in the pursuit of public polish. It began with what was called the primary removal stage, the application of a generous quantity of cold cream to the face, working it into the skin in upward circular motions that were intended not only to dissolve the day's cosmetic architecture, but to stimulate circulation in what beauty columns of the era called the subcutaneous landscape. This was not metaphor. It was the dominant medical-adjacent language of beauty in the 1950s. A deliberate melding of clinical authority with intimate domestic instruction. Pond's Cold Cream was the cathedral of this ritual. The brand, which had been operating since 1846 and had survived 2 world wars, 2 economic depressions, and the emergence of competing chemical technologies, was in 1954 the single most recognizable cold cream product in the American marketplace. Its advertising was a masterwork of aspiration. The Pond's campaign of the early 1950s deployed what the company called the testimony of the titled, advertisements featuring actual duchesses, baronesses, and members of European aristocracy who attested to their lifelong reliance on Pond's as the foundational secret of their luminous complexions. Princess Alexandra of Greece appeared in Pond's advertisements. The Duchess of Windsor appeared in Pond's advertisements. The message was architectural in its precision. This cream was not for ordinary faces. It was for faces that mattered. And if you used it, yours would matter too. Woodbury's facial cream was Pond's chief domestic competitor, and operated on a slightly different but equally potent frequency of aspiration. Where Pond's went aristocratic, Woodbury went scientific. Their advertising language in 1954 was dense with terminology borrowed from dermatological research, references to pH balance, cellular renewal, and what one particularly memorable campaign called the restoration of the skin's natural intelligence. This was not accidental. Woodbury had hired a team of consulting dermatologists whose endorsements appeared in rotating formation across the brand's print advertising throughout the decade, lending an air of medical seriousness to what was, at its core, a mixture of mineral oil, wax and water, but that does not diminish its power. Because the ritual itself, The act of cleansing, of attending to one's own face with deliberate and patient hands each evening, was doing something real, regardless of the pseudoscientific framing around it. The physical act of removing urban particulate matter, of restoring moisture to skin depleted by the central heating systems that had become standard in post-war suburban housing, of simply touching one's own face with intention. These were genuine physiological acts with genuine physiological outcomes. So, what happened if you skipped it? Here is where it gets interesting. In the short term, the visible consequences of skipping the nightly cold cream ritual in 1954 were exactly what the advertisements promised you would suffer. Dullness, dryness, and the visible accumulation of the day's chemical residue sitting atop a layer of foundation and powder that in the cosmetic formulations of that era was already considerably heavier than what contemporary women apply today. The foundation sold by Revlon, Max Factor, and Hazel Bishop in 1954 had a coverage density and an oil content that we would find almost theatrical by modern standards. These were not sheer tints or buildable serums. They were genuine masks, designed to create a flawless, poreless surface that if left on the skin overnight, would sit in the pores like wet cement in a drain. The dermatological literature of the 1950s makes repeated reference to what physicians called cosmetic occlusion as a primary cause of the adult acne that had begun appearing in women who had never previously experienced skin problems. The connection between heavy theatrical-grade foundation left on the skin and subsequent breakouts was not fully understood scientifically, but it was observed, documented, and quietly acknowledged in the beauty columns of every major women's magazine by the middle of the decade. But the more consequential dimension of what happened when you skipped your routine was not physical at all. It was social, it was structural, and it operated according to rules so thoroughly internalized by 1954 American women that most of them would not have been able to articulate the rules even as they followed them with the precision of liturgy. The nightly beauty ritual in 1954 was not simply skin maintenance. It was the period at the end of the public sentence. It was the moment when a woman formally retired from the performance of femininity, required of her waking hours, and transitioned into the private interior space of the domestic self. To skip it was, in a profound cultural sense, to refuse to close that transaction, to remain somehow publicly incomplete, to carry the detritus of the day into the sanctuary of the domestic night. Women who consistently skipped the ritual were described in magazine advice columns as letting themselves go, a phrase so common in the 1950s that it had acquired the status of a clinical diagnosis. Letting yourself go was not simply an aesthetic judgment. It was a character assessment. It implied a broader failure of the discipline and self-management that defined respectable mid-century femininity. Helena Rubinstein, who had by 1954 been operating her beauty empire for nearly half a century, and had survived everything from the Depression to the war, to the extraordinary competitive pressure of the post-war cosmetics boom, understood this dimension of the ritual perhaps better than anyone in the industry. Her advertising in the early 1950s consistently framed skincare not as vanity, but as responsibility, a duty that a woman owed not only to herself, but to her household, her marriage, and her social position. One particularly memorable Rubinstein campaign from 1953 carried the headline, "She never lets the day end carelessly." Beneath it was a photograph of an impeccably groomed woman at her vanity table, jar of Rubinstein's Skin Dew open before her, performing her nightly ritual with the focused calm of a surgeon. The implication was absolute. Carelessly ended days produced carelessly maintained lives. And carelessly maintained lives were lives that were failing. The modern mirror on all of this is both uncomfortable and clarifying, because the compulsion to maintain a skin ritual, the industry around cleansers and toners and serums and moisturizers that generates billions of dollars in revenue annually in the contemporary market, has not diminished. It has accelerated. The names on the jars have changed. The ingredients are differently formulated. The environmental toxins in the air of 21st century cities are different in composition from those of the 1950s, though they are no less present. And the psychological architecture that surrounds the ritual, the sense that attending carefully to one's own face each evening is an act of self-respect that has implications beyond the physical, that architecture is still standing. The women of 1954 cleansed with ponds and defended their complexions against the particulate legacy of coal smoke. We cleanse with micellar water and defend our complexions against the blue light of our screens. The ritual has changed its ingredients, it has not changed its meaning. What did change was the rigidity of the consequences. A woman in 1954 who skipped her cold cream faced not only the physiological outcome of uncleansed skin, but a social accounting that could ripple outward through her marriage, her neighborhood, and her professional life with a speed and thoroughness that is difficult to fully imagine from the vantage of the contemporary world. The face that went unattended was a public statement. And in 1954, very few women could afford to make that statement accidentally. The vanishing cream represented a separate but related category of product in the 1954 nightly ritual, and its distinction from cold cream is worth pausing on because the distinction reveals something genuinely interesting about how the women of that era thought about their skin and their relationship to it. Cold cream, in its foundational formulation, was an emulsion heavy enough to leave a residue on the surface of the skin. That was the point of the tissue removal step that always followed its application, and the slight lubricating film that remained after the tissue pass was considered the active moisturizing benefit of the product. The vanishing cream, by contrast, was a lighter formulation designed to disappear into the skin entirely upon application, leaving no visible surface trace. Its name was not a metaphor, but a literal description of its intended behavior. The vanishing cream was what you applied after the cold cream had done its cleansing work, what you layered over the refreshed skin surface to restore what the cleansing process had removed. In the beauty column vocabulary of 1954, the cold cream was the janitor, and the vanishing cream was the architect. One cleaned the building, the other rebuilt it for the next morning's occupants. Elizabeth Arden had built a significant portion of her extraordinarily successful skincare empire on the vanishing cream and its more elaborate cousins, the 8-hour cream that became one of the most enduring products in the history of prestige cosmetics, the Velva Moisture Film that was marketed in 1954 as a night treatment of almost pharmaceutical seriousness. Arden's advertising language for her skincare range was, like Rubinstein's, densely biological in its reference points, but considerably more aspirational in its emotional register. Where Rubinstein spoke the language of clinical authority, Arden spoke the language of romantic science. Her products were not treatments but transformations, not maintenance but metamorphosis. The woman who completed her Arden routine each evening was not simply cleaning her face. She was, according to the advertising copy that Arden's team produced throughout the early 1950s, participating in the biological poetry of cellular renewal, the nightly miracle of skin that was rebuilding itself in the dark. This language was not accidental. The 1954 consumer was, in terms of her relationship to the language of skin science, considerably more receptive to biological romanticism than the contemporary consumer, who has been sufficiently educated about cosmetics ingredients and their verified mechanisms of action that she tends to respond better to specific chemical names and peer-reviewed citations. The women of 1954 were receiving their first sustained popular exposure to the idea that the skin was a dynamic biological system rather than a static surface, and that exposure was coming primarily through the advertising copy of the companies selling them products to support that system. The result was a genuine popular enthusiasm for the biological narrative of skincare that the companies were both reflecting and constructing simultaneously. But here is the question that should be sitting with you now. If the cold cream ritual was the foundation of the 1954 beauty system, what happened when the foundation that went on top of that clean canvas, the theatrical, dense, beautifully engineered cosmetic mask of post-war American glamour, was itself the subject of its own revolution? Because in 1954, the women who were defining how all of that foundation was supposed to look were not the women next door. They were the women on the screen. And the screen had its own rules entirely. But what did the movie stars who set all these standards actually know about what their own makeup was doing to their skin? Here is something that the studio publicity machines of 1954 worked very hard to keep out of the fan magazines. The face that you were supposed to be imitating at your own vanity table was, on the women who wore it professionally, often applied over skin that was actively being damaged by the very products used to create it. Max Factor's theatrical pancake foundation, the standard base used on virtually every major studio actress of the era, contained levels of talc, mineral oil, and synthetic fragrance compounds that the dermatologists quietly consulting for the studios were privately flagging as problematic by the early 1950s. One senior esthetician at MGM, whose name does not appear in the official studio records, but whose account survives in a 1968 oral history, archived at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, described the removal process at the end of a shooting day as closer to industrial cleaning than to skincare. The products that created the luminous, poreless perfection on screen were, behind the soundstage doors, the source of considerable skin distress, and the women who wore them had entire teams of people whose sole professional function was to ensure that the removal was thorough, the skin was treated, and the face was ready to do it again the next morning. The ordinary woman watching from the third row of a Saturday matinee in 1954 had no team. She had ponds, a good mirror, and the beauty column in Photoplay magazine. The archetype she was trying to reproduce had been bifurcated by the mid-1950s into two distinct and competing philosophies of feminine glamour. And those two philosophies are so thoroughly embedded in the cultural history of the post-war decade that they function almost as a shorthand for the entire era. On one side stood Grace Kelly, on the other stood Marilyn Monroe, and between them they defined the entire aesthetic spectrum available to the American woman who was trying to understand what her face was supposed to look like when she stepped out of the house. Grace Kelly's glamour was the glamour of containment. It was the glamour of the beige cashmere sweater set, the single strand of pearls, the immaculate blonde chignon, and a face so perfectly balanced in its cosmetic presentation that it seemed to exist at a slight remove from the ordinary physics of human expressiveness. The makeup team that worked with Kelly during her years at Paramount, particularly during the extraordinary run of films she made between 1952 and 1956, operated according to a philosophy of strategic invisibility. Their task was not to transform Kelly's face, but to perfect it, which in practice meant amplifying what was already there, while erasing anything that might suggest vulnerability, casualness, or unguarded emotion. Kelly's on-screen skin was achieved through a layering process that began with a perfectly matched Max Factor foundation, moved through a strategic application of contour in deeper tones at the jaw and temple, and culminated in a pressed powder finish of almost architectural density. Her brows were groomed to an expression of permanent, composed authority. Her lips wore shades in the coral, and rose family that suggested warmth without suggesting passion. The message embedded in Kelly's face, the message that reached the women in those matinee seats, and then radiated outward into the beauty decisions they made at the 5 and dime counter on Monday morning, was that glamour was a form of self-discipline. It was the visible proof that you had your life organized, that you were not controlled by your appetites or your emotions, that you had the kind of inner architecture that expressed itself on the surface as unruffled perfection. Marilyn Monroe's face told a different story, and it told it with an entirely different set of cosmetic tools. The Monroe aesthetic, which by 1954 had become one of the most recognizable and imitated faces on the planet, was built on a foundation of calculated softness. Where Kelly's face communicated containment, Monroe's communicated availability, not in any reductive or dismissive sense, but in the genuine sense of a face that appeared to be perpetually on the threshold of an experience, perpetually slightly flushed, perpetually suggesting an interior life that was more feeling than thought. The specific cosmetic architecture that produced this effect was more technically complex than it appeared. Monroe's skin preparation involved a multi-layered foundation system that the Westmore family of Hollywood makeup artists, who collectively constituted the most powerful dynasty in the history of film cosmetics, had developed specifically for the way that Technicolor film registered certain skin tones and textures. Monroe's signature skin luminosity on screen was not the natural glow that the publicity copy described. It was a precisely engineered optical effect, achieved through the strategic application of a light-diffusing foundation base, a specific ratio of matte to shimmer powder, and a highlighting technique along the brow bone, the bridge of the nose, and the cupid's bow of the lip that created the impression of skin that caught the light, rather than simply sitting under it. Her lips, arguably the single most imitated cosmetic element of the entire 1950s decade, were a work of technical precision that the average fan magazine article translated into cheerful simplicity. The true process involved a lip liner, drawn slightly outside the natural lip edge to create the illusion of greater fullness, followed by a deeply pigmented red in the blue-toned family that photographed as a deeper, richer red on screen than it appeared in person, finished with a single touch of lighter highlight at the center of the upper lip to create the illusion of three-dimensional projection. The mirror that the woman in the matinee seat was holding up when she tried to recreate this look in her bathroom on Saturday night was reflecting a face that had been engineered by a team of 4 people using professional-grade products and specialized studio lighting as their reference. But she tried anyway. She bought the closest available drugstore approximation. Revlon's Fire and Ice, released in 1952, was the dominant cultural reference point for the blue-red lip throughout the decade. And she applied it with the best brush she could find, and she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, and she approximated the archetype as closely as the available materials allowed. This was not a failure of ambition. It was an act of genuine creative participation in a visual culture that was for the first time in human history transmitting idealized feminine faces directly into the daily lives of ordinary women, at a scale and with a vividness that previous generations had never experienced. The movie star face of 1954 was not a painting in a museum. It was a face that appeared larger than life and in luminous color, on a screen in your own town, in a theater you could walk to every single weekend. It was intimate, it was proximate, and it made the distance between the face on the screen and the face in the bathroom mirror feel like something that could, with sufficient Revlon and sufficient dedication, be meaningfully closed. The Westmore brothers understood this. Max Factor understood this. And the beauty editors at Glamour and Mademoiselle and Ladies' Home Journal understood it with particular acuity, because their entire editorial mandate by the mid-1950s had evolved around the project of translating the studio face into the civilian one. The beauty columns of that era, read now with a kind of earnest intensity that can seem almost comic in its specificity, the careful instructions for achieving the 3/4 arc brow in the Kelly style, the detailed primer on how to apply liner at the base of the upper lash in the Monroe style, the cheerful admonitions about blending, always blending. But the seriousness underneath the cheerfulness was real. These instructions mattered to the women reading them. Getting the face right was not a hobby. It was a social obligation that carried genuine stakes. What happened to the woman who could not or did not participate in this visual culture? What happened to the face that bore no visible relationship to either of the dominant archetypes? In a cultural environment where the standards for feminine presentation had been set by the most beautiful and most expertly cosmeticized faces on the planet, and then transmitted into every living room and every theater and every magazine rack in America, the unarchetyped face carried a social weight that was difficult to carry quietly. The woman who did not attempt to approximate the matinee ideal was not merely unfashionable. She was, within the social grammar of 1954, communicating something about herself that she may not have intended to communicate at all. And yet here is the thing that the fan magazines never quite said plainly, though it lived just beneath the surface of every beauty column they published. The archetype was always slightly out of reach. Not because women lacked the skill or the dedication, but because the archetype itself was, by definition, a professional construction. It was the product of studios and teams and lighting systems that no civilian could replicate. The women of 1954 were chasing a face that had been specifically designed to be beautiful at a distance, at an angle, under controlled light, by professionals. And they chased it with extraordinary dedication, every single morning, at their own vanity tables, with their own hands. And something in that pursuit, the discipline it required, the daily renewed commitment it represented, had a value entirely independent of whether the final result matched the original. The Westmore family deserves more than a passing mention in this story, because their contribution to the translation of the Hollywood face into the civilian one extended far beyond the products they developed and the techniques they refined. The 5 Westmore brothers, Perk, Ern, Wally, Bud, and Frank, collectively held positions as head makeup artists at every major Hollywood studio during the 1940s and early 1950s, which means that between them, they were responsible for the faces of virtually every major film actress working in the American studio system during the golden age of the movie star. Their collective knowledge of what photographic and cinematic light did to the human face, how it revealed certain textures and concealed others, how the camera translated 3-dimensional facial architecture into the 2-dimensional plane of the screen in ways that required specific compensations and corrections, was the most sophisticated body of practical cosmetic knowledge in the world in 1954. The extraordinary element of the Westmore legacy, from the perspective of the civilian beauty culture of the mid-1950s, is how much of that knowledge was successfully transmitted into the popular market. The Westmores wrote books. They contributed to magazine articles. They appeared on the early television programs that were beginning, by 1954, to constitute a new and powerful channel for beauty instruction. Their vocabulary, the concept of the corrective makeup technique, the vocabulary of planes and shadows and highlights, and the way they described the face as a terrain to be mapped and managed, entered the popular beauty discourse through 100 different channels, and lodged in the beauty columns, and the drugstore how-to pamphlets, and the charm school curricula that shaped how ordinary women thought about their faces. This was the democratization of expert knowledge that made the 1950s beauty culture unique in the history of cosmetics. Not just the products, but the techniques of the studio were becoming available to the civilian, translated into the language and the materials of the bathroom vanity. The anxiety this produced, the anxiety of the gap between the professional standard and the civilian achievement, was, of course, one of the most powerful engines of cosmetic sales that the industry had ever discovered. But the education was real, even if the anxiety it generated was also commercially useful. The women of 1954 who read the Westmore-influenced beauty columns and practiced the corrective techniques they described were genuinely learning something, were acquiring a vocabulary for their own faces that allowed them to see what they were doing with the tools they had and to make more intentional decisions about the results they wanted to achieve. The studio face had given civilian women not just an archetype to emulate, but a language for talking about faces that had not existed in quite the same form before the age of the movie star. Which brings us to the eyes. Because if the foundation was the skin and the archetype was the face, the eyes were the punctuation. And the punctuation of 1954 had a very specific and very unforgiving grammar. And if the face was a canvas, what exactly were the rules for the most demanding brushstroke of all? A woman who appeared at a 1954 office party without her eyes properly outlined was not described, in the language of the era, as simply underdressed. She was described as looking ill. The specific word used repeatedly in the beauty columns of that period, and in the diaries and letters of women of that generation when they were being candid about social observation, was peaky. She looked peaky. She looked as though she might have a cold or a worry, or some unnamed domestic difficulty that had prevented her from completing her morning routine. The bare eye was not a neutral choice in 1954. It was a legible social text that her neighbors and colleagues read with the fluency of long practice, and what they read in it was almost never flattering. That is the extraordinary social weight that had accrued, by the middle of the 1950s, to a cosmetic product that had only become widely available to civilian consumers in the United States in the late 1940s. Liquid eyeliner, the product that made the winged eye, the doe eye, the cat eye, and every other iteration of the dramatically defined post-war gaze possible, was, as recently as 1945, a product used almost exclusively by theatrical performers and film actresses. Its transition into the mainstream civilian beauty routine over the following decade was one of the most rapid and thorough cosmetic migrations in the history of the American beauty industry. By 1954, not wearing eyeliner was as conspicuous as wearing it had been a decade earlier. The technical history of liquid liner is more interesting than its current ubiquity might suggest. The formulas available to consumers in 1954 were genuinely challenging to work with. Thick, fast-drying, intensely pigmented liquids that had to be applied with a fine-tipped brush or a felt-tip applicator that bore no resemblance to the forgiving, flexible brushes that contemporary liner products feature. The application window was narrow. The margin for error was essentially zero. A liner line that was not perfectly steady, not perfectly symmetrical, not perfectly angled at the precise outer corner of the eye that the current fashion demanded could not simply be blended or smudged away as a pencil application might have been. Liquid liner, once set, was set. Correction required complete removal and a fresh start, which in the dense foundation and powder environment of 1954 morning makeup meant potentially disrupting an entire layer of carefully constructed surface. Mastering liquid liner was a genuine acquired skill, and the women who could apply it freehand with the speed and precision that the morning routine demanded had invested real time in developing that skill. Helena Rubinstein was one of the dominant forces in making liquid liner accessible to the civilian market. Her eyeliner in a bottle, introduced in the early 1950s, was accompanied by advertising that was unusually technical for the beauty industry of that era. Diagrams of the eye showing the precise angle and length of the outer wing, instructions for anchoring the wrist to create a steadier line, guidance on the appropriate thickness of line relative to the depth of the eye socket. Rubinstein had understood something that most of her competitors had not yet fully grasped, that the expansion of the theatrical eye into the civilian beauty routine required not just the product, but the instruction set. Women who had grown up with powder eyeshadow and a careful pencil needed to be taught how to use liquid liner, and they needed to be taught in terms that were practical and specific rather than aspirationally vague. Max Factor's eyelining pencil and, later, his liquid liner range approached the same problem from a different angle, the angle of the studio. Factor's educational materials for his civilian liner range drew explicitly on the technical vocabulary of his film work, translating the language of the makeup chair into the language of the bathroom mirror. This was an extraordinarily effective marketing strategy, because it carried with it the implicit promise that the woman who followed these instructions was accessing the same knowledge that had created the faces she saw on screen every weekend. She was not approximating the studio technique. She was using it. And what exactly was the winged liner communicating? This is the question that is most fascinating about the 1954 eye, because the answer is considerably more layered than it might appear. At the most literal level, the winged liner was an elongating technique. It extended the apparent length of the eye's horizontal axis, creating a larger, more defined, more dramatically shaped eye than the natural one. But it was also doing something more subtle and more culturally specific. The upswept outer wing of the 1954 liner application was, in its particular angle and its particular energy, the cosmetic articulation of a very specific kind of feminine alertness. It was the face of a woman who was paying attention. It was the face of a woman who was present, engaged, sharp, and fully arrived at whatever social situation she was occupying. The wide, bright, clearly defined eye of 1954 did not communicate passivity or submission. It communicated attentiveness, a quality that the women of that decade were required to embody in the most literal possible sense, because the social and domestic roles they occupied required a constant vigilance that expressed itself, cosmetically, as perpetual, beautifully outlined wakefulness. The doe eye, the rounder, fuller variant of the defined eye that was associated primarily with Monroe and with the softer femininity archetype, used liner differently. The Monroe-influenced doe eye application opened the liner line slightly at the center of the upper lid, creating the optical illusion of greater roundness, and swept the wing at a lower, gentler angle than the sharper Kelly-influenced cat eye. Where the cat eye said alert, the doe eye said open. Both were performing versions of visual attentiveness. They were just performing it in different registers, one suggesting the cool, evaluating attention of a woman who was thoroughly in command of her situation, the other suggesting the warm, receiving attention of a woman who was utterly absorbed by it. Neither was neutral. Both required the product. And the consequences of arriving at a social situation in 1954 without one or the other were specific and immediate. The women who understood the social grammar of the defined eye wore it consistently, not as an optional embellishment, but as a fundamental element of their public face, without which they did not feel fully dressed. Women who were interviewed for oral history projects in the 1970s and 80s about their 1950s experiences returned again and again to this specific element of the morning routine. Not to foundation, not to lipstick, but to eyeliner, as the single product whose absence most dramatically altered their sense of readiness for public life. One woman, interviewed in 1979 for a social history project at the University of Michigan, described leaving the house without her liner as feeling like going out without her teeth. The language is hyperbolic, but the underlying truth it contains is genuine. The defined eye had become, by 1954, not an optional enhancement, but a baseline expectation. The minimum required evidence that a woman had attended to herself with sufficient seriousness to be taken seriously in return. The lower lid received its own treatment in this era, and it was a treatment that diverged from contemporary practice in ways that are striking when you look at the photographs. The 1954 lower liner application was bolder than what the contemporary eye would consider appropriate. A full liner line applied to the inner rim of the lower lid, a technique called tight lining, combined in some cases with a heavier application of black or dark brown shadow along the lower lash line that gave the eye a dramatic intensity that was, on screen and in daylight, genuinely theatrical. The photographs of ordinary women from this era, not the Hollywood archetypes but the actual civilian women captured in the snapshot photography of daily life, show eyes that have a focused, almost fierce definition that we have come to think of as the exclusive property of professional makeup. In 1954, it was Tuesday morning. The skill required to maintain this look over the course of a day, to keep the lower liner from migrating into the under-eye area, to prevent the upper line from cracking, as the day's facial movements creased the lid, was itself a form of beauty expertise that the women of that era carried as invisible knowledge. They knew which formulas were more prone to smudging in summer heat. They knew how to blot and powder the lid to extend the liner's life. They knew, through practice accumulated over years, exactly how their own particular eyes received the product and what adjustments the formula and the technique required. This was professional knowledge democratized into domestic expertise. It was the studio technique living in the bathroom vanity drawer of every suburban house on every block. The lower register coding of the unlined eye in 1954, the social reading of bare lids as evidence of incomplete preparation or possible distress, operated most powerfully not in the formal social occasions where beauty standards were most explicitly enforced, but in the casual environments of daily life, where the standards were internalized as background assumptions rather than conscious requirements. The office, the grocery store, the school pickup, the neighbors encountered over the fence. These were the environments in which the absence of liner was most acutely registered, because these were environments in which one's appearance was read not against a formal standard, but against the daily baseline that the community around you had come to expect. To fall below that baseline, even in the most casual setting, even without anyone formally articulating the expectation, was to introduce a note of social dissonance that carried its own low-level but persistent consequences. The specific eyeshadow practices of 1954 were the backdrop against which the liner performed its defining role. Cream eyeshadow, the dominant format of the era, was applied with a fingertip rather than a brush, in a technique that was considerably less precise than what the liner then achieved over the top of it. The colors available in the mainstream American market in 1954 were concentrated in a fairly narrow palette. Blue and blue-gray were the most popular, considered flattering for both blue and brown eyes. Soft taupe and brown were the practical daytime options, and the increasingly adventurous use of green and teal that would characterize the later 1950s was just beginning to appear in the fashion-forward pages of the glossier magazines. The application of cream shadow in this period was intended to create a diffuse, graduated deepening of the lid that provided depth and dimension to the eye socket without sharp definition. the sharp definition being the province of the liner that would follow it. Max Factor's Pancake Foundation, which had been developed specifically for use in Technicolor film production and released to the civilian market with the company's characteristic commercial flair, was by 1954 one of the most widely used face products in the American mass market. Its texture, a compressed cake of pigmented powder that was activated by moisture and applied with a damp sponge, was different enough from the bottle and stick foundations that competed with it to feel genuinely novel. And its coverage was, for many users, more complete and more uniform than anything they had previously used. The face that emerged from a proper pancake application was the face that the liner was designed to animate. A smooth, even surface that functioned as a canvas for the eye definition and the lip color that would transform it from technical achievement into social credential. The liner was the signature on the painting. Without it, the work was unsigned. And in 1954, unsigned faces attracted the kind of social attention that most women found it preferable to avoid. Ask yourself this: if the eye was the punctuation, and the foundation was the sentence, and the cold cream was the page, what was the fuel that kept the whole apparatus running? What was a woman in 1954 actually consuming, physically and metabolically, in order to maintain the energy and the physical foundation that all of this cosmetic architecture was meant to enhance? Because the answer to that question is one of the most colorful, most bizarre, and most genuinely fascinating chapters in the entire history of post-war American femininity. So what was a 1954 woman actually putting into her body to sustain all of this? In 1954, a nationally distributed diet pamphlet published by the Women's Health Bureau recommended that American women consume nothing but unflavored Knox gelatin, dissolved in hot water, 2 cups of black coffee, and a single hard-boiled egg for the first 3 days of any weight reduction program. The pamphlet described this as a scientific cleansing protocol designed to firm the jawline and tighten the subcutaneous tissue of the neck. It sold 120,000 copies in its first year of publication. This author was a man with no medical credentials whatsoever, whose previous publication had been a guide to growing prize-winning roses. This was not unusual. This was, in many respects, simply the prevailing standard of nutritional authority in 1954. What happened to your body if you did not maintain the right silhouette in 1954 was a consequence that operated on an entirely different register from what happened to your face if you skipped your cleansing routine. The face could be recovered in 20 minutes with the right products. The body operated on a longer timeline, a more punishing one. And the social consequences of a body that did not conform to the prescribed post-war feminine silhouette were not the gentle neighborhood concern that greeted an unpolished complexion. They were structural. They were embedded in the architecture of the clothing itself. The post-war feminine silhouette, the nipped waist, the gently rounded hip, the slightly lifted bust that Christian Dior had introduced to the world with his New Look collection in 1947, and that American manufacturers had spent the intervening 7 years translating into every price point of the domestic clothing market, was a silhouette that required a very specific body to wear correctly. Not a natural body, not an unmanaged body. A body that had been disciplined into a particular shape through a combination of foundation garments, dietary management, and the kind of sustained physical self-awareness that the women of that era simply called watching oneself. Watching oneself was the phrase. Not dieting, not calorie restriction. Watching oneself implied a relationship to one's own physical presentation that was fundamentally observational, as though the woman in question were a separate entity from her body, standing slightly to one side of it and monitoring its behavior with the vigilant attention of a concerned parent watching a child near a swimming pool. The dietary culture that supported this watching in 1954 was a landscape of extraordinary variety and extraordinary peculiarity. The scientific understanding of human nutrition was in a genuinely transitional state during this period. The foundational research into caloric metabolism, hormonal influences on weight, and the metabolic differences between macronutrients was actively in progress. And the popular press's translation of that research into practical dietary guidance was, to put it charitably, creative. The calorie-counting craze that had swept through American women's magazines in the late 1940s had by 1954 evolved into something more nuanced, and considerably more eccentric. The gelatin regimen was perhaps the most prominent feature of this landscape. Knox gelatin, which had been a staple of American cooking since the 1880s, had by the 1950s become the darling of the diet food world, for reasons that were a mixture of genuine dietary thinking and spectacular marketing invention. The company's advertising in the early 1950s made extravagant claims about gelatin's benefits for weight management, skin quality, nail strength, and joint health, claims that were based on the protein content of gelatin. It is technically a complete protein, though one with a notably incomplete amino acid profile, and amplified by the enthusiastic endorsement of beauty columnists who found in gelatin a product that could serve simultaneously as a food, a beauty treatment, and a social performance. Gelatin molds were, by 1954, one of the dominant forms of post-war entertaining. Elaborate architectural confections that suspended vegetables, fruits, meats, and in some particularly ambitious cases, entire meals within shimmering towers of set collagen. They appeared on every Jell-O advertisement, every women's magazine entertaining spread, every suburban cookbook published in the 1950s. They were beautiful in a way that was entirely specific to their era, and they communicated something important about the 1950s relationship between food, beauty, and control. Food that had been disciplined into a perfect, transparent, quivering form was the most appropriate food for women who were themselves engaged in the project of disciplining their bodies into a perfect, controlled form. The tomato juice and egg yolk diet was a different animal entirely. A low-calorie regimen whose chief nutritional feature was its extreme simplicity, and whose chief cultural feature was its suggestion of European sophistication. Tomato juice, which had become strongly associated with the spa and resort culture of the European leisure class through its adoption by upscale American hotels in the 1930s, carried an air of refined abstemiousness that made it the ideal vehicle for a diet philosophy based on elegant deprivation. You were not starving yourself. You were taking your nutrients in a manner that implied discernment and self-possession. The egg yolk component, added for its fat content and its protein density in a formulation that predated by several decades the current nutritional understanding of dietary fat, was the earnest nutritional attempt within an otherwise aesthetically driven regimen. The early high society calorie-counting manuals that circulated among the aspirationally minded women of 1954 were a fascinating genre. Dorothy Carnegie, wife of the motivational writer Dale Carnegie, and author of her own best-selling guide to feminine self-improvement, recommended a specific daily intake of 1,400 calories distributed across 5 small meals, a prescription that her contemporary counterparts in the nutritional science community would have found reasonably defensible, surrounded as it was by advice that was considerably less so. The manuals that circulated in women's clubs and church groups and the social networks of post-war suburban life often contained advice that ranged from the merely outdated to the genuinely alarming. Vinegar and water as an appetite suppressant, the strategic consumption of black coffee to accelerate the metabolism, the recommendation to drink a full glass of warm water with lemon before every meal, as a gastric preparation that would somehow reduce the amount of the subsequent meal that was absorbed. What is striking about all of this, looking back from the vantage of 7 decades, is not the scientific inadequacy of the nutritional thinking, which was real and which had real consequences for the women who followed these regimens faithfully, but the extraordinary sincerity with which it was pursued. The women of 1954, who consumed their Knox gelatin and their tomato juice and their carefully counted 1,400 daily calories, were not foolish. They were operating in good faith within a system of nutritional authority that had not yet developed the scientific tools to give them better information, and they were doing so under social pressures that were as concrete and as consequential as any we face today. The body that fit the new-look silhouette was not optional equipment in 1954 America. It was a professional asset, a social credential, and in many marriages, a contractual performance. Failing to maintain it was failing at something that the culture of the moment had designated as a fundamental feminine responsibility. And the industry that served this imperative was not small. The diet food category in 1954 was generating revenues in the tens of millions of dollars annually and growing rapidly, fueled by a combination of genuine consumer desire for effective weight management tools and an advertising culture that had perfected the art of creating anxiety and then immediately offering its commercial resolution. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company published the height-weight tables that had become the dominant cultural reference for appropriate feminine size. Tables that were, as subsequent research would demonstrate, based on actuarial data that had been designed for insurance purposes and was being used as a biological standard for which it had never been intended. The women who consulted these tables, and by 1954 millions of them did, and found themselves above the prescribed weight for their height, experienced something that we would now recognize as medically unjustified distress, and that the era recognized as the appropriate motivation for renewed dietary discipline, the metrical phenomenon, which would fully bloom in the early 1960s with the introduction of the first commercially successful meal replacement liquid diet, was in 1954 still in its early stages. Nutritional drinks and powder supplements were available, but had not yet achieved the mass market penetration that they would reach in the following decade. The most popular dietary aids available to the 1954 woman were, in addition to the food-based regimens already described, a range of pharmaceutical amphetamine products that were legally available on prescription and widely prescribed for what doctors of the era called appetite control. The amphetamine diet pill was a genuinely mainstream part of the 1954 weight management landscape, not a fringe phenomenon or a celebrity secret, but a standard medical tool that was dispensed by general practitioners across the country to women whose weight their physicians considered medically or socially problematic. The energy and the appetite suppression they produced were real. The long-term consequences were not yet understood. Consider this as you reach for whatever you eat for breakfast tomorrow morning. The woman of 1954 was managing her body in a landscape of radically incomplete scientific knowledge, under social pressures of extraordinary intensity, with pharmaceutical tools whose safety profile was essentially unknown, in pursuit of a silhouette that required a specific architecture of undergarments beneath it to achieve its full effect. The food was part of the beauty routine. The beauty routine was part of the food. And the whole system was wrapped in a layer of social expectation so dense that escaping it was not a matter of personal choice. It was a matter of social survival. The sociological dimension of the 1954 diet culture becomes fully visible when you examine where the information was flowing, who was producing the nutritional guidance, who was consuming it, and what social channels were carrying it between them. The women's clubs of post-war suburban America were a primary distribution network for dietary information that ranged from the medically reasonable to the extraordinarily dubious, transmitted in the social currency of advice between women who trusted each other in the way that people trust the members of their own community, rather than the members of an anonymous professional class. If your neighbor, the woman you traded recipes with, whose children played with your children, whose opinion you valued on matters of domestic management, told you that the gelatin and black coffee protocol had helped her lose 8 pounds before the Hendersons' anniversary party, that testimony carried a persuasive weight that no medical journal article could match, primarily because no medical journal article was addressing itself to you in your kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. The doctor in 1954 was a figure of considerable authority in the American domestic landscape, but that authority was experienced primarily through the filter of the general practitioner office visit, a formal, slightly intimidating encounter that most women of the era were not having more than once or twice a year. And that was focused primarily on acute medical issues rather than the ambient management of body weight and appearance. The cosmetics industry had recognized this gap and had moved into it with the confident authority of entities that were providing something the women of 1954 genuinely needed and were not getting from the medical establishment: specific, practical, daily guidance on the management of their physical selves, in a social environment that measured and judged that management with great attentiveness. That the guidance was commercially motivated and scientifically dubious in significant portions did not diminish its practical utility as a social framework. It gave women a language for their bodies, a structure for their daily physical self-management, and a community of shared practice that connected them to each other and to a broader cultural project of self-improvement that felt, because it was, in its deepest social dimension, genuinely serious and genuinely important. The caloric restriction required to maintain the post-war silhouette at its prescribed dimensions was, for many women, considerably more demanding than the magazine guidance made it appear. The tone of the diet column in 1954 was relentlessly cheerful. The 1,200-calorie menu was described as satisfying. The gelatin snack was described as delicious, The evening willpower required to decline the second serving of the casserole was described as empowering. Beneath the cheerfulness was a discipline that was, by any reasonable nutritional standard, quite rigorous. And that was being performed by women who were simultaneously managing households, preparing food for families whose caloric requirements were different from their own, and maintaining the full apparatus of social and domestic performance that this compilation has been documenting from its first paragraph. The 1954 woman who was dieting while cooking. She was restricting while feeding. She was watching herself while feeding everyone else. The psychological complexity of that position was not, for the most part, named in the beauty and diet literature of the era. But it was lived. Which raises the question of what happened at night, when the food had been carefully consumed, and the calories had been carefully counted, and the body had been maintained within its prescribed dimensions. What did you do then to the hair that had spent the entire day performing its own demanding social function? But where did the perfect wave come from? And who was paying the price, night after night, to produce it? There are documented cases, and this is not hyperbole. This is in the social complaint records of several New York City apartment buildings from the early 1950s, of women being formally reported to their building superintendents by neighbors who observed them entering the lobby with their pin curl nets still in place. The complaint was not that the women were underdressed. The complaint was that they were exposing the machinery of their own maintenance in a communal space, which violated the social contract that held that the work of feminine self-production was to be conducted entirely behind closed doors, and was to produce results that appeared entirely effortless. You could look like you had been born with perfect waves. You could not look like you had spent the previous 8 hours achieving them. This was the paradox at the center of the pin curl ritual, and it was a paradox that the women of 1954 navigated with a dedication that was, by any measure, extraordinary. Because the soft, bouncy, gently waved hair that was the dominant feminine hair aesthetic of the mid-1950s, the hair that appeared on every magazine cover, every film poster, every television advertisement, did not occur naturally on the heads of most American women. It was manufactured. It was manufactured each night through a process of considerable technical complexity and physical discomfort. And it was presented each morning as though it was simply the state in which the hair had chosen to exist. The pin curl method that was standard practice in 1954 was a technique that had been refined through decades of professional salon practice into a highly systematized domestic ritual. The fundamental principle was mechanical. Wet hair, when wound into a tight coil and allowed to dry in that configuration, would hold the curved shape as the hydrogen bonds within the hair shaft reformed around the new architecture. This is not fundamentally different from the science behind the contemporary blow-dry technique, or the modern curling iron. All of them are using heat and water and mechanical tension to temporarily reorganize the molecular architecture of the hair. But the 1954 method had no heat component and required an overnight drying time that made it a fundamentally nocturnal practice. The setting process began after the hair had been washed and was still damp, not soaking, which would have extended the drying time beyond manageability, but thoroughly moist in a way that required careful timing relative to bedtime. A setting lotion was applied to the damp hair before the curling process began. These lotions, sold under brand names including Helene Curtis's Spraynet, Alberto VO5's setting lotion, and the Tony Home Permanent brand's line of setting products, were designed to coat the individual hair shaft with a film that would harden slightly as it dried, providing both hold and a degree of protection against humidity that was the primary enemy of the set curl in all seasons. The formulas of 1954 setting lotions were considerably heavier than contemporary styling products. They had a tackiness when wet and a stiffness when dry that the hair of the era was required to manage throughout the following day's activities, without access to the smoothing and frizz-controlling technologies that subsequent decades would produce. The curl division itself was the most technically demanding part of the process. The hair was divided into sections, the number and size of which determined the eventual wave pattern, with smaller sections producing tighter curls and larger sections producing broader, softer waves. And each section was wound from the tip toward the scalp in a flat coil that lay against the head. The direction of the wind determined the direction of the resulting wave. Sections wound toward the face would produce waves that fell toward the face. Sections wound away from the face would produce waves that fell away from it. A skilled woman planning her set was thinking several moves ahead, not just about individual curls, but about the pattern of the whole, the way adjacent curls would interact when released, the direction of the overall movement that the finished style would create. It was three-dimensional spatial reasoning conducted in the mirror at 10 o'clock at night. The pin, the tool that gave the method its name, was a metal spring clip or a bobby pin that held the wound curl flat against the head while it dried. The metal spring clip was the preferred professional tool, offering a more secure hold than the bobby pin without leaving the double indentation that the bobby pin sometimes pressed into the outer surface of the curl. By 1954, the American hardware and beauty supply market was manufacturing these clips in quantities measured in the hundreds of millions annually, a genuinely extraordinary number that speaks to the universality of the practice. Every woman who used them owned dozens, carried them in small decorative cases in her handbag for emergency touch-ups and repairs, and knew their tendency to drift toward the drain in the bathroom sink in a way that made them perpetually in need of replenishment. The net that covered the completed set for sleeping was its own category of domestic artifact. The hairnet of 1954 ranged from purely functional, a simple mesh of nylon or fine cotton that held the curls in place against the mechanical disturbances of sleep, to surprisingly decorative, with versions available in every color and several materials, including silk chiffon, which was the aspirational option for the woman who spent enough time in her own boudoir that the night net was itself a performance of elegance. The simplicity and butterick pattern catalogues of the era included patterns for hand-sewn boudoir caps, designed to cover the pin curl, set in a manner that was simultaneously practical and visually appropriate for the domestic theatrical space of the marital bedroom. The marriage bed in 1954 was itself a stage, and the stage management extended to the props. Sleeping in the set was not comfortable. This is a fact so consistently documented in the first-hand accounts of women of the era that it can be stated with confidence, and it is a fact that the era itself acknowledged with remarkable candor. The discomfort of the pin curl set was one of the most frequently joked about topics in the domestic humor columns of 1954 women's magazines. The metal clips pressed against the scalp with a persistence that was most acutely felt in the first hours of sleep, and that experienced practitioners learned to manage through a combination of clip placement strategy, sleeping position adjustment, and the cultivation of a particular tolerance that was simply part of the price of the morning result. Women who were new to the method and who had not yet developed this tolerance were sometimes observed in the domestic comedy sections of those same magazines as stumbling toward the bathroom at 3 a.m. to remove the most offending clips and replace them with bobby pins, which were not comfortable either, but were at least less sharp. The morning ceremony of taking down the set was, in its own way, as important as the setting process itself. The curls were released from their clips and their net carefully, maintaining their wound form as long as possible before the final brushing that would transform the individual coils into the flowing, unified wave pattern that was the whole point of the exercise. This brushing was not casual. It was performed with a bristle brush. The natural boar bristle brush was the standard of the era, considered superior to synthetic alternatives for its ability to distribute the hair's natural oils along the shaft while simultaneously smoothing the cuticle, and executed in long, smooth strokes that followed the direction of the intended wave pattern. The number and force of the strokes determined how much the individual curls were separated and blended into each other, and the judgment required to achieve the right degree of separation, enough to create the soft, natural-looking wave, not so much as to produce the frizzy, indeterminate cloud that was the nightmare outcome of an overbrushed set, was itself an acquired skill. Tony Home Permanents, whose advertising in the early 1950s had introduced the concept of the home permanent wave to millions of American women who had previously been dependent on salon services for this treatment, had by 1954 significantly altered the landscape of the pin curl ritual. The permanent wave, which used a chemical process to permanently restructure the disulfide bonds within the hair shaft, creating a lasting curl pattern that did not require the nightly setting process, was being adopted by a growing percentage of American women as a partial alternative to the pin curl method. Partial because the home permanent itself required the setting process to create the specific wave pattern desired. The chemical provided the lasting curl capacity, but the physical shape was still determined by the mechanics of the set. The Tony Twin advertising campaign, which showed pairs of identically waved women and challenged viewers to identify which had been salon waved and which had been Tony home waved, was one of the most effective advertising campaigns of the decade, precisely because it named and then dramatically dissolved the anxiety about the gap between professional results and domestic ones. It is worth pausing here to notice something about the women who performed this ritual night after night, year after year, with the consistency and the physical dedication that the historical record so clearly documents. They were not doing it because they had been told to. They were doing it because they had genuinely internalized the value of the result, the soft, polished, architected hair that was the visual shorthand in 1954 for a woman who had her life and her self-management under precise control. The discomfort was real, the skill was real, and the morning result, when everything had gone according to plan, and the brush had done its work, and the soft, bouncing waves were falling exactly as they had been engineered to fall, was a result that filled the women who achieved it with a satisfaction that was entirely independent of anyone else's observation of it. The Alberto VO5 conditioning hairdressing, that was among the most widely sold hairstyling products of the mid-1950s, occupies an interesting position in the pin curl ecology of the era, because it served a dual function that was not always clearly distinguished in its advertising. The VO5 formula, which contained 5 vitamins and a conditioning oil blend that gave the product its name, was marketed both as a pre-setting conditioning treatment and as a finishing product, which meant it appeared at both ends of the pin curl process, applied to the damp hair before setting to soften and condition, and applied in tiny quantities to the finished brushed-out style to smooth the surface and add the slight luminosity that was the era's standard for well-maintained hair health. The product's amber color and the distinctive scent of its oil base made it immediately recognizable in the bathrooms of millions of American women in 1954, and its ubiquity gives it a status in the material culture of the decade, comparable to Pond's cold cream in the skincare category. It was simply there, in every household, as a baseline element of the grooming landscape that no one had to explain or justify, because everyone already understood its purpose. The institutional dimension of the 1954 hair culture, the professional salon as the center of the weekly or bi-weekly social ritual that framed the pin curl's domestic practice, is an element that the at-home focus of this particular volume should not be allowed to obscure. The beauty salon of the 1950s was not merely a service establishment. It was a social institution of considerable community importance, particularly in the suburban landscapes of the post-war decade, where women who did not have professional employment had fewer community gathering spaces than their urban counterparts. The weekly appointment, the wash, set and style that most American women who could afford the time and the modest expense maintained as a standard element of their social schedule was at once a practical maintenance service, a social gathering in which the intimate physical environment of the salon chair created a particular kind of community that could not be replicated in other settings, and an occasion for the sharing of information that ranged from domestic advice to neighborhood news to the kind of candid emotional exchange that the slightly confessional atmosphere of the shampoo bowl and the hooded dryer seemed to invite in a way that the more performative social environments of the cocktail hour or the church social did not. The dryer itself, the large hooded device that enclosed the head in a warm, isolating dome, and provided both the heat and the enforced stillness that completed the setting process after the pins and the curlers had done their work, had a psychological dimension that was regularly noted in the popular press of the era. Beneath the dryer, you could not hear very well. You could not engage in sustained conversation. You were temporarily outside the social flow of the salon, present but not fully available, enclosed in your own warm private capsule, while the process that was transforming your hair completed its work. Women of the era described the dryer time in oral histories with a consistency that is striking. It was, for many of them, one of the only formally sanctioned moments of enforced idleness in a week that was otherwise structured around continuous domestic productivity. You sat. The heat hummed. The magazines piled in your lap went unread because the dryer was too noisy for sustained concentration. And for 45 minutes, no one expected anything of you, but someone was always watching. And in the social landscape of 1954, the manner in which you wore your body, your face, and your hair in public had formal institutional dimensions that we have largely forgotten. Dimensions that were, in the most organized form, taught in buildings with curricula and instructors and tuition fees. And who, precisely, was teaching all of these women the grammar of looking right? The enrollment brochure for the Patricia Stevens Finishing School's 1954 academic year contained a sentence so blunt in its assessment of feminine social consequence that it reads now as almost brutally honest. The sentence was, "Young women who neglect the cultivation of their natural assets and social graces invite professional and personal failure, not as a possibility, but as a statistical certainty." This was not a fringe opinion expressed by a marginal institution. Patricia Stevens was one of the largest and most respected finishing school chains in the United States, with campuses in 12 cities, and an alumni base that included women who had gone on to careers in modeling, broadcasting, retail management, and the professional hostess circuit of the 1950s social economy. The brochure's frankness about the consequences of social unpreparedness was, if anything, a selling point. Parents paid for frankness. They paid for it because the culture surrounding them confirmed it at every level. The charm school, the finishing house, the etiquette academy, call it what you will, these institutions occupied a peculiar and genuinely important position in the social infrastructure of 1954 America. They were not schools in any conventional academic sense, though some of the more prestigious ones issued certificates and diplomas with considerable graphic ceremony. They were training grounds for a specific and highly codified performance of femininity that had its own vocabulary, its own physical grammar, and its own system of rewards and consequences. The woman who completed the Patricia Stevens curriculum, or the John Robert Powers program, or the Barbizon School curriculum, which in the 1950s had expanded far beyond its original modeling academy mandate to encompass a broad program of social and personal development, emerged with a set of skills that were as practically applicable to the social and professional landscape of that moment as any technical certification. The most famous of these skills was the one that has survived longest in the popular cultural memory of the era: the posture exercise. The book balanced on the crown of the head, the spine aligned against the wall, the deliberate cultivation of what the charm school instructors of the period called the invisible string, the imagined upward pull from the crown that kept the head lifted, the shoulders back, and the sternum open without the visible tension of the squared military posture that was considered masculine and therefore inappropriate. The feminine ideal of the 1954 posture was not stiff. It was fluid. It was the posture of a woman who appeared to move through space as though the space were cooperating with her. The mechanics of achieving this posture were taught with considerable physical rigor. The book on the head was not metaphor. It was a daily drill that was part of the curriculum in every serious finishing program of the era, executed while walking, while turning, while mounting stairs, while sitting down into a chair and rising from it again. The sitting and rising exercises were their own sub-discipline. The correct method of lowering oneself into a chair required approaching the seat from the front rather than the side, making contact with the back of the knees against the chair's edge before the descent, and lowering with the torso upright and the knees together, in a movement that was the precise opposite of the collapsed drop that fatigue or informality might otherwise produce. Rising reversed the sequence with equal precision. These were not trivial concerns. In the heavily skirted silhouettes of 1954, the full circle skirts, the net petticoats, the fitted pencil skirts, the mechanics of sitting and rising were genuinely complex physical negotiations that an untrained woman could fumble in ways that were visibly, irretrievably unelegant. The grammar of the proper entrance was its own chapter in the charm school curriculum, and it was, in its specific requirements, one of the most performatively demanding skills in the entire program. A woman entering a room in 1954 was expected to pause, briefly but definitively, in the doorway. This pause was not hesitation. It was the social equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence, a formal notation that a new presence had arrived and was available to be acknowledged. It gave the room's occupants the opportunity to perform their part of the social script, the greeting, the introduction, the indication of where the new arrival should direct herself. A woman who entered a room without this pause was described by the charm school instructors of the era as rushing in, which was considered not just socially incorrect but subtly aggressive, an imposition of one's own timeline on the social timing of a room one was entering as a guest. The vocal component of the charm school curriculum has received less popular attention than the physical posture work, but it was in many respects the most practically consequential element of the training. The specific grammar of 1954 parlor room introductions was a formalized system with rules about the order in which names were spoken. Persons of greater social seniority received the introduction first, a convention that required a lightning-fast social calculation every time an introduction was performed. The specific verbal formulas that were considered appropriate versus those that were considered too casual, too formal, or in some way tonally misaligned with the specific social register of the occasion. The phrase "pleased to meet you" was, by the 1950s etiquette standards taught in finishing schools, already considered slightly lower register than the preferred "how do you do," which had the additional advantage of being technically a greeting rather than a statement, and therefore required no literal response. "I'm so happy to meet you" was too effusive for a first introduction, and risked the social capital of appearing too eager. The calibration required was precise and constant. Conversation maintenance was taught with equal specificity. The curriculum distinguished between what it called bridge topics, subjects that were universally safe for social conversation with new acquaintances, and what it called depth topics, which required an established social relationship before they could be safely explored. Bridge topics in 1954 included the weather as rendered through current local experience rather than meteorological opinion, mutual acquaintances mentioned with approving brevity rather than gossip, and recent events that were cultural rather than political in character. A new film, a popular song, a notable civic occasion, politics, religion, personal finances, health difficulties, and anything touching on the domestic circumstances of either party were depth topics and were to be carefully avoided in all but the most established social relationships. The conversational boundary system was particularly interesting in its treatment of the woman's own opinions. The finishing schools of the 1950s did not, by and large, teach women to be opinionless. That is a reductive misreading of what was actually quite a nuanced social curriculum. What they taught was opinion management, the skill of forming an opinion, holding it with conviction, and expressing it in a social context in a manner that was contributive rather than confrontational. The distinction was performative rather than intellectual. The same opinion expressed with a slight upward inflection at the end, framed as a question or an observation rather than a declaration, was socially acceptable in a mixed company setting, where the same opinion delivered as a flat statement might have generated friction. The finishing schools were teaching women to be socially effective, which in the context of 1954 meant being socially effective within a system that was not designed to maximize women's intellectual authority at dinner parties. This is where the complexity of the charm school legacy becomes most interesting. Because the skills being taught were simultaneously enabling and constraining, they gave women genuine social tools that made them more effective in the environments they actually occupied, while also defining those environments in ways that limited the range of social tools that were considered appropriate. A woman who had been through the Patricia Stevens program in 1954 was better equipped to navigate a dinner party, a job interview, a charity committee meeting, and a department store negotiation than her untrained counterpart. She was also trained to operate within social parameters that kept the range of appropriate behavior narrower than it might otherwise have been. What happened if you skipped the charm school? If you arrived at the social occasions of 1954 without the training, the vocabulary, and the physical grammar that these institutions provided? The consequences were, once again, legible and specific. The woman who entered a room without the pause, who sat down without the mechanics, who made introductions in the wrong order, or with the wrong verbal formula, was not considered ill-bred in the domestic sense of the term. She was considered untrained, which in the social vocabulary of 1954 was a different and in some ways more treatable diagnosis. Untrained meant that the tools were not there yet. The assumption was that they could be acquired. This was, in a perverse way, the most commercially clever feature of the finishing school's cultural logic. It positioned its services as the solution to a problem that it had also helped to define. The John Robert Powers Modelling and Finishing School, which had been operating since the 1920s and was by 1954 one of the most recognizable names in the American social education landscape, approached the charm school curriculum with a commercial sophistication that Patricia Stevens's more regionally focused chain could not quite match. Powers understood early that the aspiration he was selling was not just social competence, but professional opportunity, specifically the opportunity of the modelling career, which in the 1950s had acquired a social prestige and a cultural visibility that made it the most powerful, aspirational magnet available to young women whose ambitions exceeded the domestic horizon that their immediate community offered. The Powers School's curriculum did not fundamentally differ from Patricia Stevens's in its practical content. The posture work, the introduction formulas, the walking instruction, the voice and diction coaching were consistent across the finishing school field. But the frame around that content was different. At Stevens, you were learning to be a better presented version of your current self. At Powers, you might be learning to become something entirely different. The voice and diction component of the 1954 finishing school curriculum deserves attention because it addresses something that the visual emphasis of most discussions of 1950s feminine presentation tends to obscure. The sound of a properly trained voice was as much a part of the complete social presentation as the look of a properly maintained face. The regional accent, and in 1954, regional American accents were considerably more distinct and more socially coded than they are today, following 70 additional years of media homogenization, was in certain contexts either an asset or a liability, depending on which accent you carried and where you were carrying it. The New England boarding school accent communicated a social background that required no further credential. The Appalachian or Deep South accent in the professional environments of 1954's northern cities communicated a social background that was immediately read as requiring remediation. The finishing schools offered that remediation in the form of voice training that targeted breath support, vowel modification, and the specific patterns of stress and rhythm that characterized what was then called Standard American Speech, a dialect that was, in practice, modeled on the speech patterns of the Upper Midwest and the educated Northeast. And that was becoming, through the influence of radio and early television, the emerging national standard. The intersection of voice training and beauty instruction in the charm school curriculum was not, from the perspective of the women who sought that training, an odd combination. The voice and the face were both surfaces of the same performance. Both were being shaped and refined toward the same end, which was a public presentation that communicated the specific cluster of qualities that 1954 American society valued in a woman: composure, attentiveness, warmth without effusiveness, intelligence without aggression, physical presence without ostentation. The finishing school taught all of these as integrated skills rather than separate subjects because they were, in the social reality of 1954, experienced as integrated. You could not successfully deploy the perfect introduction formula in a voice that undermined the formula's social register. The face and the voice were together the instrument. The finishing school was the music school. And what went into the handbag that accompanied the trained woman to all of these social occasions, held at the prescribed angle, with the prescribed grip, the handbag that was never simply a container, but was itself a social instrument of considerable subtlety, housing a specific set of objects whose presence was as required as the posture and the vocabulary, and whose public deployment was governed by its own elaborate code. So, what lived inside the bag that accompanied all of this trained, groomed, finished perfection out into the world? A woman who reached into her handbag at a 1954 social occasion and failed to produce a powder compact when the general moment of face-tending arrived, when other women at the table, or in the powder room, or in the theatre lobby, were performing the brief, practiced ritual of compact opening and mirror consulting and puff applying that served as both a genuine cosmetic refreshment and a social synchronization gesture, was committing an omission that registered in the social atmosphere of the room with surprising clarity. She was not simply going without powder. She was absent from a ritual that her companions were performing together, which made her absence visible in a way that mere unfashionability would not have been. The compact was not a cosmetic tool dressed up as a social accessory. It was a social accessory that happened to contain a cosmetic tool. The distinction mattered enormously. The powder compact had been, for several decades before 1954, one of the most aesthetically and technically developed categories of portable personal object in the world. The tradition of the decorative compact, the small hinged case housing a mirror, a pressed powder cake, and a small application puff, had roots in the early 20th century, but it reached its full artistic and commercial flowering in the interwar period and the early post-war years, when the combination of available manufacturing technologies, the post-war expansion of disposable consumer income, and a beauty culture that was simultaneously more democratic and more systematized than anything that had preceded it, produced compacts that were by any measure small masterpieces of decorative craft. Stratton of London was the dominant name in the quality compact market of 1954, and the Stratton compact was to the mid-century powder case what Pond's cold cream was to the mid-century skincare routine, the reference point against which other options were measured, the aspirational object that every woman wanted, and a significant percentage of American women own. The Stratton self-opening compact, a spring-loaded design that released the lid when a small lever was pressed, eliminating the need for the two-handed opening gesture that was considered slightly clumsy in public settings, had been introduced in the late 1940s and had, by 1954, become one of the best-selling imported cosmetic accessories in the American market. The mechanism was, for the era, a feat of miniaturized engineering, a precisely calibrated spring, contained within a case that might measure 2.5 inches in diameter and 1/4 inch in depth, that could be operated with one hand, while the other managed a handbag or a cocktail glass. This was not a trivial design achievement, and the fact that it had been achieved in service of a gesture performed by women at social gatherings was not, in 1954, considered a minor application of engineering talent. It was considered exactly the right application of it. The decorative surfaces of the Stratton compacts of this era are worth dwelling on, because they are a genuine record of the aesthetic values of mid-century feminine material culture. The enamel work on the better Stratton cases of the early 1950s deployed colors and geometric patterns that drew from the same visual vocabulary as the abstract painting that was contemporaneously transforming the fine art world. Bold divisions of field, strong color relationships, the kind of confident visual geometry that communicated modernist confidence without sacrificing feminine delicacy. The floral designs that populated the larger popular market operated in a different register, but with equal craft. The painted enamel roses and lily-of-the-valley sprays on the mid-range compacts of that era were produced by artisans whose level of technical skill would be financially prohibitive to replicate today. American compact manufacturers, Volupté, Evans, Elgin American, were producing their own variants in the same period, and the American market had its own aesthetic flavor, slightly bolder, slightly more ornate, leaning toward the theatrical rather than the classical in its decorative choices. The Volupté compact in particular had developed by the early 1950s a line of novelty shapes, compacts disguised as handbags, as playing cards, as books, as musical instruments, that were not so much cosmetic tools as wearable jokes. A humor about feminine artifice that existed in productive tension with the seriousness of the ritual they contained. The powder itself, the product inside the compact, was in 1954 a considerably heavier and more opaque substance than the translucent finishing powders and setting sprays that have come to dominate the contemporary market. Pressed powder in the 1954 formulation was designed for visible coverage and visible opacity, for the restoration, midday, of the smooth, even surface that the morning's foundation had created, and that the day's natural oils and environmental elements had begun to disturb. The talc content was high. The pigmentation was calibrated to match the skin tone of the wearer as precisely as the range of available shades allowed, which in 1954 was less precisely than it would be today, since the standard shade range across most major brands ran to perhaps 8 or 10 options, where contemporary luxury brands offer dozens or hundreds. The physical application by puff, a small round cushion of velvet or chamois leather that came fitted inside the compact, was designed to press the powder into the skin rather than sweep it across the surface, which was what prevented the powder from displacing the foundation beneath it and creating the chalky, unblended look that was the aesthetic failure mode of overpowdering. The mirror inside the compact was the feature that most directly served the social function of the object. Because the powder compact, in its moment of public deployment, was not primarily about the powder. It was about the performance of self-awareness, the public demonstration that you were maintaining your presentation with active vigilance, that you were attending to yourself in the brief, graceful, socially appropriate manner of a woman who cared about how she appeared to the world. The mirror consultation that accompanied the compact opening was itself a choreographed gesture. The compact opened toward the face at a slight angle. The eyes moved to the mirror for the assessment. The puff was applied with brief, precise movements. The compact was closed and returned to the handbag in a single, continuous sequence that, in the hands of a practiced woman, took perhaps 15 seconds and communicated a volume of social information in that brief interval. What it communicated, at its most fundamental level, was attention. It communicated that you were the kind of woman who paid attention to herself, which in the social vocabulary of 1954 was not a self-absorbed quality, but a responsible one. The woman who attended to herself was the woman who could attend to others. The woman who allowed her public presentation to deteriorate through inattention was, by extension, a woman who might not be reliably attentive to the other responsibilities she carried. The psychological weight of the compact, the degree to which it functioned as what we might now call an emotional regulation object, is documented in the first-hand accounts of women of the era with a frequency that is striking. Women who were anxious in social situations described the compact as an anchor, a physical object they could touch and use that gave them a sanctioned reason to briefly withdraw their attention from the social environment, check in with their own appearance, and return to the public space feeling more composed. The compact was a permitted pause. In a social world that required constant attentiveness and constant performance, the moment of compact consultation was a legitimate rest stop. You were attending to yourself rather than to others, and everyone understood that and accepted it, because everyone participated in the same ritual. The mirror inside that compact was showing a specific version of a face, a powdered, finished, deliberately constructed version of a face that existed at one remove from the unmediated physical reality of the skin beneath. And in 1954, that remove was not considered a deception. It was considered a courtesy. You were presenting to the world the most organized and intentional version of your face, just as you were presenting the most organized and intentional version of yourself. The raw, unfinished face, the face that had not been attended to, was not more real. It was simply less prepared. The specific physical experience of wearing the powder compact's pressed cake formula in the 1954 climate, particularly in the humid summers of the American South and Midwest that constituted the thermal reality of the majority of the country's population, was a dimension of the ritual that the advertising photography of the era, with its precisely controlled studio environments, could not accurately represent. The compact that looked luminous and dry and freshly perfect in the magazine advertisement was, in actual practice, a product that responded to the heat and humidity of summer in ways that required a significantly more frequent and a significantly more skilled reapplication process than the advertisements implied. The pressed powder in summer tended to sit differently on a skin surface that was already producing natural oils in response to the heat, and the result of a careless reapplication in those conditions was the exact chalky, unblended surface that was the aesthetic failure mode the compact was supposed to prevent. Skilled users of the compact in high humidity environments had developed specific techniques for managing this, blotting the skin surface lightly with a dry tissue before the powder application, using the puff with a pressing rather than a sweeping motion, working from the center of the face outward to avoid building up excess product at the hairline and along the jaw. That were the kind of specific environmental adaptations that beauty columnists in the southern editions of women's magazines addressed with the particular authority of people writing for readers who were dealing with these conditions every day. The social function of the compact at the formal evening occasion, the dinner party, the theatre, the charity ball, the wedding reception, was elevated to its most performative register in these contexts, where the quality of the compact itself was visible to others in a way that it was not in the casual midday environments. The compact that was produced from an evening bag in the powder room of a better restaurant or hotel in 1954 was read by the other women present with an evaluative attention that the compact's owner generally understood, and that she had taken into account when selecting the piece. A Stratton compact in the powder room of the Waldorf communicated a specific social coordinate. A drugstore compact in the same setting communicated a different one. This was not the most important social signal that a woman carried into those spaces, but it was one of the ones over which she had complete control, which made it, psychologically, one of the ones she was most likely to attend to carefully. The compact was portable status that fit in a clutch. The women of 1954 understood that, and they shopped for compacts accordingly. The collecting culture around the powder compact that would develop more fully in subsequent decades had its origins in the 1950s, appreciation for the compact as a designed object with genuine craft value. Women who began acquiring compacts in this period, who developed preferences for particular makers, particular enamel styles, particular mechanical designs, were participating in an emerging consumer aesthetic that was beginning to recognize the domestic and personal accessories of mid-century feminine life as worthy of the same evaluative attention that was applied to more formally recognized categories of decorative art. The Miriam Haskell jewelry that accompanied the compact in the evening bag of the well-dressed 1954 woman shared this quality. It was work of genuine craft that had been produced at a scale, and for a market that placed it outside the conventional fine jewelry category, while giving it a visual intelligence and a material quality that exceeded what the category designation implied. But what about the larger domestic stage on which all of this preparation was deployed? What about the organized and intentional home that was itself required to perform, as reliably as the organized and intentional face that moved through it? Because the social occasion that gathered the women with their Stratton compacts and their carefully maintained faces together in one room was itself the product of a labor whose complexity rivaled the beauty routine in its demands, and whose standards were, in their own way, equally unforgiving. And when all of those polished women arrived at the party, who was responsible for the room they walked into? A 1954 Good Housekeeping Entertaining Guide contained, in its chapter on cocktail party hosting, the following instruction. The hostess who greets her first guests without lipstick has committed the same social error as the hostess who serves warm cocktails. Both failures are equally visible, equally uncomfortable for the guest, and equally reflective of a preparation that was not fully completed. This equivalence between an unconditioned lip and an improperly iced drink may seem extraordinary from the contemporary vantage point. In 1954, it was not a provocative comparison. It was simply an organizational principle, placed alongside instructions for the arrangement of the bar cart with the same matter-of-fact authority as a recipe or a seating plan. The cocktail hour of 1954 was not a casual gathering. It was a performance with a formal structure, a prescribed cast of characters, a specific set of required props, and an aesthetic standard that was measured and adjudicated by its participants with the critical attention of people who understood that the social occasion was a primary arena in which status was established, confirmed, contested, or revised. The suburban home of the post-war decade was not merely a private domestic space. It was the primary theatre of the social economy that governed post-war middle-class American life, and the hostess of the cocktail hour was its director, its set designer, its star performer, and its stage manager simultaneously. The physical preparation required to host a successful cocktail hour in 1954 began, according to the standards of the era's entertaining literature, not on the day of the event, but 3 days before it. The crystal, because 1954 entertaining did not use ordinary glass for cocktail service, it used crystal, or aspired to crystal, and the aspiration itself communicated something important about the social seriousness of the occasion, required washing by hand, drying by hand with a lint-free cloth, and inspecting for water spots that would catch the light in ways that communicated carelessness. The specific geometry of the crystal glassware arrangement on the bar cart was not arbitrary. The highball glasses were placed to the right, the lowball glasses to their left, the cocktail coupes at a slight elevation on the second shelf of the cart, and the stemmed wine glasses, if wine was to be offered, which in the era of the cocktail party was by no means certain, at the back where they were visible as a statement of hospitality range, without dominating the presentation of the spirits that were the occasion's primary social offering. The bar cart itself was a piece of furniture whose presence in the living room of a 1954 suburban home was a social statement as specific as any item of the hostess's wardrobe. The chrome and glass rolling cart that had become the dominant form in the post-war period communicated a particular kind of mid-century modernism, forward-looking, casually sophisticated, comfortable with consumption as a legitimate leisure activity, that distinguished its owners from both the austere domesticity of the pre-war generation and the more self-consciously bohemian aesthetic of the artistic social circles that occupied a parallel universe of post-war American social life. The bottles on the cart were themselves organized according to a logic that was part aesthetic and part narrative. The good bourbon at the front, because bourbon was the decade's defining spirit, and its prominent placement communicated seriousness. The gin in the secondary position because the gin martini was the cocktail that sophisticated guests were most likely to request, the scotch as evidence of international awareness, and the lighter spirits, rum, vodka, which was only then beginning its ascent from immigrant spirit to mainstream one, at the rear as options rather than features. The food preparation required for the cocktail hour occupied a temporal and logistical space that is difficult to fully appreciate without understanding the kitchen equipment and preservation technologies available in 1954. The refrigerator was standard in post-war suburban homes, but its capacity was considerably more limited than its contemporary counterpart, and the food processing tools that would make the mid-century appetizer repertoires more ambitious items, the elaborate molded spreads, the stuffed celery, the carefully garnished canapés, were either manual or primitive by current standards. The deviled egg was the foundational appetizer of the 1954 cocktail hour, and its preparation illustrates both the labor involved and the specific aesthetic thinking behind it. The eggs, always fresh, always of uniform size, always cooked to a specific point of doneness that left the yolk set but not dry, were halved with a precision that was itself a demonstration of kitchen skill. A clean, even cut that produced two identical boat-shaped white holders, each capable of accepting its filling without toppling. The yolks were combined with mayonnaise, dry mustard, white vinegar, a precise amount of salt, and in the more ambitious versions, a small quantity of sweet pickle relish. And this mixture was piped, not spooned, but piped from a pastry bag, into the white halves in a pattern that demonstrated control and intention. A sprinkle of paprika completed each egg with a color accent that served both aesthetic and organizational functions. It marked the eggs as done and distinguished them from any ungarnished version that might suggest incompletion. The hostess's management of the conversation flow at the cocktail hour was considered an art form in the entertaining literature of the era, and it was taught in the same systematic fashion as the bar cart arrangement and the egg piping. The geometry of conversation, the way a hostess was supposed to circulate through her own gathering, never becoming so absorbed in one conversation as to leave another group without the anchoring presence of the host family's engagement, was described in the 1954 entertaining manuals with the spatial precision of a traffic engineer. The hostess was to move in a circuit of the room, spending no more than 4 minutes in any single conversational cluster, before extracting herself with a phrase that acknowledged the current conversation, suggested its continuance without her, and introduced the direction of her next movement. A kind of social navigation that required the simultaneous tracking of multiple conversational states across the room, while appearing to be completely present in the one immediately at hand. The orchestration of introductions at the cocktail hour was where the charm school training met its most demanding practical application. The hostess of a successful cocktail hour was responsible for ensuring that no guest spent more than 3 minutes in the party without having been introduced to at least 2 other people, which required the hostess to carry a constantly updated mental map of the room's social architecture, who knew whom, who was likely to find common ground with whom, who was in danger of conversational isolation, and which conversations had run their natural course, and needed the injection of a new participant to refresh their energy. The specific introduction formulas she deployed, the brief, context-setting introduction that gave each new pair of conversation partners a starting point, were not improvised. They were planned, at least in their general shape in advance of the gathering, as part of the preparatory process that began 3 days before the event. The physical appearance of the hostess at her own cocktail hour was the dimension of the preparation that connected the entertaining event back to the personal beauty routine, and it was treated in the entertaining literature of the era with exactly the same systematic attention as the bar cart and the deviled egg. The hostess's dress for the cocktail hour was a specific category, neither the casual informality of daytime wear nor the full formality of evening gown, that had its own name in 1954 fashion vocabulary, the cocktail dress. This was a garment designed for the 3-hour window of informal evening entertainment that the cocktail party occupied, constructed to be animated and presentable at the beginning of the evening, and to have survived the 3 hours of circulation, greeting, and gracious performance, with its integrity intact. The neckline was modest enough for mixed company, the skirt full enough to be festive, the fabric substantial enough to hold its shape through an evening of active hospitality. And beneath the cocktail dress, the full architecture of the 1954 foundation garment, the girdle, the long-line brassiere, the smooth nylon stocking anchored to garter belt, was maintaining the physical silhouette that the dress was designed to display. The hostess's lipstick was refreshed, as the Good Housekeeping Guide had specified, before the first guest arrived. Her hair was set and pinned and swept into the style that she had decided upon during the preparation days, supplemented where necessary by the small lacquer application of the finishing spray that would hold it through the evening's social circulation. Her compact was in her apron pocket during the preparation, and in her evening bag during the event itself, available for the mid-party lipstick check that was the hostess's only legitimate moment of personal self-attention, in an evening otherwise entirely dedicated to the needs and comforts of her guests. What happened when any element of this preparation was incomplete? When the crystal had water spots, or the eggs were piped unevenly, or the hostess answered the door with unrefreshed lipstick or hair that had not survived the kitchen portion of the evening intact? The answer, in the intimate social world of 1954, was immediate and specific. Guests noticed, they noted, they discussed. And the judgment that was rendered over the following days in the telephone conversations and the coffee visits that constituted the social maintenance network of post-war suburban life was both detailed and durable. Social reputation in the mid-century American suburb was an asset that required the same consistent maintenance as a complexion. Neglect it for a single occasion, and the effects were visible. Neglect it consistently, and the damage accumulated. Yet beneath all of this, beneath the crystal and the eggs and the bar cart and the lipstick and the circulating conversational geometry, there was something genuine. There was the real pleasure of a well-organized gathering, the real satisfaction of a room full of people who were comfortable and enjoying themselves and feeling attended to, the real warmth of a home that had been prepared with care for the pleasure of friends. The machinery was elaborate, the standards were demanding, but the thing the machinery was in service of, the human generosity of a well-hosted gathering, was not an illusion. It was the thing itself. The relationship between the cocktail hour and the broader social economy of post-war suburban life becomes most visible when you examine the strategic function that the party invitation served in the community networks of the mid-century American suburb. The suburb itself, the new Levittown-derived communities that were absorbing the post-war population of young married couples with their GI Bill mortgages and their baby-boom children, was a social landscape that had to be built from scratch by its inhabitants. Because the established community networks that had existed in the urban neighborhoods and small towns from which many of these families had come did not transfer automatically to the newly constructed streets of the post-war development. The cocktail party was one of the primary tools by which those networks were constructed. It was a structured occasion that allowed new neighbors to meet under conditions of formalized hospitality, to assess each other according to the shared standards of the era, to establish the social coordinates of the families around them in the taxonomy of mutual acquaintance and social compatibility that was the foundation of community life. The bar cart was, in this social context, a political object as much as a domestic one. The spirits it displayed communicated the household's relationship to the social pleasures of the era in a way that was immediately readable by other adults of the same social class. A well-stocked bar cart communicated that this was a household that participated in the social culture of adult leisure, that these were people who had made the transition from the wartime austerity and the early post-war scarcity into the consumer confidence of the mid-decade prosperity without becoming either ostentatiously lavish or anxiously retentive about it. The balance that the bar cart was supposed to strike, generous but not showy, well supplied but not excessive, was a balance that expressed, in the specific language of domestic provision, the social philosophy of the responsible suburban prosperity that the 1950s aspired to represent. The geography of the cocktail party room in the 1954 suburban home had its own logic that was determined partly by the physical layout of the typical post-war house and partly by the social dynamics of the party itself. The living room, the formal room that was in many post-war suburban homes, reserved specifically for adult entertaining and kept in a state of maintained readiness that the family's daily life did not disturb, was the primary territory of the cocktail hour. The bar cart was typically positioned at one end of the room, both for practical access and for the psychological function of giving arriving guests an immediate destination and an immediate social transaction, the drink. The food table, or the circulating trays of canapés, provided a secondary social destination and a reason for movement through the room that prevented the kind of static clustering that reduced the hostess's ability to engineer the conversation flow she was managing. The fireplace, if the house had one, was the gravitational center of the room's social energy in the cooler months. People gathered near it with the atavistic comfort of warmth, and a skilled hostess positioned her more challenging social configurations in its vicinity, relying on the fireplace's warming social energy to ease conversations that might otherwise have required more hostess management. Now consider the woman moving through that room in her full cocktail hour costume, the dress, the foundation garments, the pinned hair, the refreshed lipstick. Strip away the gathering, the guests, the social machinery. Consider just the clothing itself. Consider what she was wearing underneath that cocktail dress, and why it had to be exactly what it was. Beneath the dress that held the room together, what kind of architecture was holding the woman together? There are training manuals in the historical records of several high-end department store chains. Neiman Marcus, Lord & Taylor. Saks Fifth Avenue, from the early 1950s, that contain instructions for floor staff that would be legally and commercially impossible today. These instructions specified that saleswomen were to use their judgment in assessing whether a customer's figure, as it appeared in the store's dressing rooms, was appropriately supported before allowing the customer to commit to a purchase in a silhouette that required specific underpinnings to achieve its correct effect. This was not a compassionate intervention. It was a quality control mechanism designed to protect the store's reputation by ensuring that its clothing was worn, in public, in the manner that its design required. The foundation garment, the girdle, the long-line brassiere, the waist cincher, was not optional equipment in 1954 fashion. It was structural. It was the load-bearing architecture beneath the visible surface, and the garments that sat on top of it had been designed, cut, and fitted with its presence assumed. The new look silhouette that had defined post-war fashion since Dior's 1947 collection was, by 1954, so thoroughly embedded in the design language of American clothing at every price point that its physical requirements had become invisible, which is to say, everyone understood them, and no one needed to articulate them because they were simply part of what wearing clothes meant. The nipped waist, that was the visual centerpiece of the silhouette, required a specific physical waist measurement, or required a foundation garment capable of achieving that measurement regardless of the natural one, and the smooth, uninterrupted line from waist to hip that completed the silhouette's lower arc required that the transition between the two be managed beneath the fabric with a controlled precision that only structured undergarments could provide. The girdle was the primary instrument of this management. The word carries, in contemporary usage, implications of discomfort and restriction that are accurate as far as they go, but that miss something important about how the garment was understood and experienced by the women who wore it in 1954. The girdle was not, in the cultural consciousness of that moment, a punitive device. It was a structural tool, as mundane and as functional as a bra, which was itself a structural tool whose mechanics most contemporary women accept without question. The women of 1954 had grown up in homes where their mothers wore girdles and their grandmothers had worn corsets. And the progressive lightening of that understructure over the preceding half-century, from the rigid-boned corset of the Victorian era to the flexible rubber and nylon girdle of the 1950s, represented, in the lived experience of women who had a generational comparison available to them, a genuine liberalization. The 1954 girdle, which was typically a tube or open-bottom garment in a lightweight elasticized fabric that provided compression without the rigid boning of its predecessors, was experienced by many of its wearers as a normal, comfortable part of daily dress that they had simply always worn, and expected to continue wearing as a matter of course. What happened to the body of a woman who appeared in public without her girdle in 1954? The physical answer was that the clothing she was wearing, if it was designed and constructed to the standard silhouette, would not hang correctly. The fabric would not fall smoothly from waist to hip. The skirt's fullness would not distribute evenly around the leg. The seams would pull in the wrong directions. The result was what the fashion literature of the era called a poor fit, a phrase that in the context of the 1950s carried a moral dimension that contemporary fashion vocabulary does not attach to fit. A poor fit communicated not only that the garment was wrong for the body, but that the body was wrong for the garment, which meant, by extension, that the body was insufficiently managed, which meant that the woman inhabiting it was insufficiently attentive to the standards of physical presentation that 1954 expected of her. The crinoline petticoat that was the defining silhouette element of the decade's full-skirt fashion was a structural garment of considerable physical presence. The full crinolines that supported the most extravagant versions of the post-war silhouette, the kind that appeared in the fashion photography of the era's premier magazines, in the store windows of the better department stores, in the pages of the Vogue and Harper's Bazaar of the mid-1950s, were architectural objects, layers of stiffened netting over a base of taffeta or cambric, built up into a cone that could measure as much as 3 yards in circumference at its hem, and that required careful storage, hung from special hangers or stored in tissue-lined boxes to preserve its volume. The more everyday versions of the crinoline, which the average American woman wore under her circle skirt for church or for a Saturday shopping trip, rather than for the formal occasions that demanded the full architectural petticoat, were more modest in their construction, but no less obligatory in their social context. The flat, unbouffant skirt, the skirt that laid against the leg rather than standing away from it, was not appropriate daywear in 1954 unless it was a pencil skirt, which was its own distinct category of garment with its own distinct set of underpinning requirements. Gloves complete the picture. The glove requirement of 1954 is perhaps the single element of the era's dress code that requires the most conscious effort of historical imagination to fully grasp. Because gloves have so thoroughly disappeared from the daily dress of contemporary women that their presence as mandatory accessories for public occasions in the mid-century period seems almost theatrical. They were not theatrical. They were as functionally mandatory as shoes. The short white cotton glove for daytime shopping and church, the longer kid leather glove for afternoon occasions, the elbow-length kid or satin glove for formal evening events. These were not optional enhancements to an outfit, but required components of a complete dressed state. A woman without gloves at a 1954 daytime social occasion was as conspicuously incomplete as a woman without shoes. The glove was the hand's equivalent of the compact, a signal of the degree of attention and preparation that the wearer had invested in her public appearance, and its absence was as legible and as social a communication as the presence of unpolished nails or unset hair. The specific rules governing glove selection for the daylight versus evening distinction were codified in the etiquette manuals of the era with the precision of legal code. Short gloves in light colors, white, cream, light gray, for morning and early afternoon. longer gloves in the same palette for afternoon occasions of greater formality, with the length increasing in proportion to the formality of the event. Full-length evening gloves in kid, suede or satin for formal evening events, removing only the index finger and thumb if the event required the wearing of a ring that the glove would otherwise cover. Gloves were always put on before leaving the house and removed in the correct sequence for the type of glove, upon arrival at the destination, a movement that was itself a social signal, the removal of the gloves communicating arrival and settlement in a specific social space. Putting gloves back on communicated departure. These were not arbitrary rituals. They were a language, and it was a language that everyone in the room spoke fluently. The complete dressed state of a 1954 woman preparing for a formal occasion, the foundation garments, the crinoline, the dress, the gloves, the shoes, the hat. If it was that kind of occasion, the jewelry, the handbag, was a construction process that could take an hour and a half from the morning shower to the moment of departure, and it produced a physical result that was, at its best, genuinely beautiful in the specific aesthetic vocabulary of the decade. The photographs of the era's best fashion documentation show women who look, in their full 1954 presentation, not constrained but composed, assembled with an intention and a completeness that has its own visual power, distinct from any era before or after. The specific formulation of the girdle in 1954 was the product of several decades of materials science development that had dramatically altered the physical experience of wearing it from the experience of wearing the garments that had preceded it. The rubber panty girdle that had been the standard in the 1930s and early 40s was, by 1954, being rapidly displaced by garments made in the new synthetic elastic fabrics, Lastex and its successors, that offered comparable or superior control with considerably less weight, considerably better ventilation, and considerably more flexibility in movement than the rubber alternatives. The Maidenform and Warner's girdle lines of the early 1950s were marketing these new materials with the enthusiasm of companies that understood they were selling a genuinely improved product, and that the improvement was significant enough to address one of the primary complaints that had attended the rubber girdle's reign. The heat. Rubber does not breathe. In the summer months, a rubber girdle was an instrument of genuine physical suffering for the women who wore it, and its replacement by the more breathable synthetic elastics was experienced by those women as a real improvement in daily comfort, even within the continued requirement of the garment's presence. The long-line brassiere that accompanied the girdle in the 1954 foundation garment ensemble was a garment whose engineering complexity is genuinely impressive when you examine it closely. The long line, which extended the brassiere's foundation from the bust to the waist, and in some versions to the hip, was designed to work in concert with the girdle, to create a continuous, smooth foundation line from bust to thigh, eliminating the gap at the midriff, where ungoverned flesh might otherwise disrupt the perfect line of the dress above. The construction of a well-made long line in this period involved multiple different fabrics, and a system of boning, elastic panels, and strategic seaming that was the work of genuine technical expertise, the better foundations of the era, made by companies including Warner's, Maidenform, Formfit, and the premium end of the Sears Catalog's foundation department, were sized with a specificity that went beyond the cup and band measurement system that governs contemporary brassiere sizing. The foundation garment was fitted, ideally, through a personal measurement appointment with a trained fitter at a department store foundation department, a service that the major department stores of 1954 offered with the same seriousness that they offered alterations for suits, and that was considered as essential for the proper fit of foundation garments, as the tailor's fitting was considered essential for the proper fit of a dress. The stocking and garter belt were the final elements of the foundation layer, and they were elements that required their own maintenance discipline. Nylon stockings in 1954 were fragile in a way that contemporary hosiery is not. They ran easily, they sagged at the knee and ankle, if not properly tensioned by the garter belt, and they had to be washed by hand and laid flat to dry in a way that added a significant increment of daily labor to the already demanding laundry routine of the household. The stocking that ran was an immediate social problem in 1954, not a minor inconvenience, but a visible evidence of incompletion that required prompt address. Women carried spare stockings in their handbags for exactly this reason, the equivalent, in the textile category, of the backup lipstick that lived alongside the compact in the evening bag. The point was readiness. The point was always, in 1954, readiness. But all of that assembled presentation, the foundation, the crinoline, the gloves, the hair, the eyes, the compact, was incomplete without the single cosmetic element that functioned in 1954 as both the final punctuation of the beauty routine and its most psychologically freighted component. The element that a woman applied last, before the mirror, before she left the house, and that she checked first when she reached into her bag at any social occasion. The red lipstick, the one that was not simply a colour but a statement, a history, a piece of armour that the women of 1954 wore with a knowing pride that went considerably deeper than vanity. And at the end of all of it, the cold cream, the liner, the set curls, the girdle, the gloves, the compact. What was the last thing she put on before she left the house? In the spring of 1945, when the Allied armies entered the concentration camps of liberated Europe, the first relief supplies sent by the British Red Cross included, alongside food and medicine, lipstick. This is documented historical fact. The decision was made by a senior Red Cross official who believed, and whose belief was subsequently validated by the accounts of the camp survivors, that the act of applying lipstick was not a trivial cosmetic gesture, but a powerful restoration of individual identity and personal dignity, in a context where both had been systematically and deliberately destroyed. The women who received the lipstick used it. Some of them had not held such a thing in years, and the act of applying it, the small, intentional, self-directed act of deciding what one's lips would look like, was, in the accounts of those who witnessed it, something that stood at the intersection of the political and the personal in a way that no policy document could fully articulate. That is where the red lipstick of 1954 comes from. Not from a cosmetics laboratory, though it came from those too. Not from a fashion editorial, though it inhabited those with great confidence. It comes from that moment, and from the wartime years that preceded it, when red lipstick was not a beauty accessory, but a weapon of morale, and an assertion of civilization against everything that was trying to destroy it. The wartime history of red lipstick in the United States is a story that begins with the 1941 government directive that specifically exempted cosmetics from wartime austerity restrictions on consumer goods, on the grounds that lipstick and rouge and powder were essential to the maintenance of feminine morale on the home front, and therefore essential to the maintenance of the productivity that the war economy required. General beauty supplies were not rationed in the United States during the Second World War in the manner that food, gasoline, and rubber were rationed, and the reasoning behind that decision is significant. The war planners had made a specific determination that the psychological well-being of American women, and by extension the social fabric of the communities those women held together while their men were abroad, was a strategic asset. Maintaining access to cosmetics was maintaining access to the tools of that well-being. Red lipstick was the specific shade that became the symbolic center of this wartime cosmetics culture. The military services developed their own shade guidelines. The United States Marine Corps famously requested that Helena Rubinstein develop a specific red that would coordinate with the Corps' dress uniform, a commission that Rubinstein accepted and executed with characteristic commercial and aesthetic thoroughness. And the civilian population adopted the red lip as its own parallel declaration of determined continuity. Wearing red lipstick in 1943 was a political act as much as a cosmetic one. It said, "We are still here, we are still ourselves. We have not surrendered the standards of our civilization to the exigencies of the war. We are doing what we have always done, and we will continue to do it until the men come home. And when they do, we will be exactly what we were when they left." The men came home, and the red lipstick stayed. But it stayed in a different key. The wartime red had been angular and fierce, a red worn as a statement of resistance with the compressed energy of a fist held quietly at one side. The peacetime red of 1954 was softer in its social context, but no less intentional in its meaning. It had been translated from the language of political assertion into the language of social authority, and in that translation it had gained certain dimensions of meaning that the wartime formulation had not possessed. The post-war red lip was not a war cry. It was a credential. It was the visible proof, applied each morning in the bathroom mirror with the practiced ease of long habit, that the woman wearing it was a fully operational member of the social world she occupied, that she had met the minimum requirements for public presentation that the era demanded, and had done so with sufficient thoroughness to deploy its most visible and most intentional marker. Tangy Natural, which had been one of the best-selling lipstick formulas in the United States since the 1930s, occupied one end of the 1954 red lipstick spectrum. Tangy's genius was chemical. The formula contained a color change mechanism that caused the pigment, which appeared orange in the tube, to shift toward the wearer's individual lip chemistry upon contact with the skin, producing a shade of pink or coral that was supposedly uniquely calibrated to the individual's natural coloring. This was, in the 1930s and 40s, a revolutionary cosmetic proposition, the democratic lip, the shade that worked for everyone, and it had built Tangy into one of the most popular drugstore lipstick brands in American history. By 1954, Tangy was still selling in enormous quantities, but the red it produced on most wearers, a softened, personalized version of red that leaned toward the rose and coral end of the spectrum, had come to represent a specific social position within the broader red lipstick landscape. The Tangy red was the red of the accessible, the approachable, the feminine but not aggressive social presentation. Revlon's red was something else entirely. Charles Revson, who had built Revlon from a nail enamel company into the dominant cosmetics manufacturer of the post-war period through a combination of genuine product innovation and extraordinary advertising instinct, had understood from the early days of his career that the red lipstick was not a product. It was an aspiration. Every campaign Revlon ran in the 1950s was built around a version of the red lip that was slightly beyond the ordinary, not merely red, but specifically, nameably, memorably red. Fire and Ice, the 1952 campaign that introduced what would become one of Revlon's most iconic shade names, was built around a shade that walked the precise edge between blue-toned red and true red. And it was accompanied by an advertising campaign whose questionnaire, "Are you made for fire and ice?" asked women whether they fit a specifically self-possessed, specifically pleasure-oriented, specifically unapologetic feminine profile. The questionnaire was the product. The lipstick was the trophy for women who answered yes. Hazel Bishop, Revlon's primary competitor in the 1954 mass-market lipstick space, had introduced in 1950 its no-smear lipstick, a formula innovation that permanently altered the market by addressing the single most technically frustrating dimension of lipstick wear. The no-smear formula was the first commercially successful long-wear lipstick in the American market, and its introduction was the trigger for what would become a decade-long arms race between the major cosmetics manufacturers around the durability of the lip color. The woman of 1954, who checked her lipstick in her Stratton Compact at the cocktail party, was checking for the specific type of wear that her particular formula was prone to, the center fade of some formulas, the feathering into lip lines of others, the transfer to glassware that all formulas of the era produced to some degree, but that the no-smear competitors worked to minimize. What happened to the woman in 1954 who left the house without her red lipstick? The answer by this point in our history should be clear in its basic architecture. She was leaving the house without her credential, without her signal, without the final element of a presentation that the social world around her had been trained to read as complete, and that was, without it, visibly incomplete. But it is worth naming specifically what that incompleteness communicated in the vocabulary of that specific cultural moment. It communicated not simply that she had not finished getting dressed. It communicated that she had not fully arrived at the social role that the morning's preparation was designed to instantiate. The red lip was the final step of a ritual that was, in its entirety, an act of self-creation, the daily reassertion of a specific social identity that had to be actively constructed each morning and actively maintained throughout the day. The women of 1954 who performed this construction knew it was construction. They were not naive about the nature of the performance. The letters columns and diary excerpts and oral histories of the era contained too many moments of wry self-awareness about the demands and the absurdities of the beauty routine to support any reading of the 1954 woman as an innocent victim of a cosmetic ideological apparatus she could not see. She could see it. She participated in it anyway, sometimes with genuine pleasure, sometimes with resigned compliance, sometimes with a subversive creativity that found in the available materials a means of expressing an individual identity that exceeded any single prescribed archetype. She wore the red lipstick, and she wore it as her own. And here is what we carry forward from her. Not the specific formulas, the heavy talc foundations, the toxic hair lacquers, the amphetamine diet pills have been replaced by things that are safer, if not always wiser. Not the specific social architecture, the girdles are largely gone, the gloves are gone, the charm school formulas for proper introductions have dissolved into the more fluid social grammar of the contemporary world. What we carry forward is the deeper logic of the ritual, the understanding that the daily practice of attending to one's own appearance is not vanity, but a form of self-authorship, a daily act of deciding who you will be today and what you will communicate to the world about what matters to you. The women of 1954 attended to themselves with extraordinary dedication, under constraints we would not accept, and with tools we would not choose, in pursuit of a standard we could not satisfy. And in that daily pursuit, they created something real. They created themselves, version by version, morning by morning, compact click by compact click, with the red lipstick as the final and most confident mark of their own deliberately constructed presence in the world. The women who made the choice to wear red lipstick in the immediate post-war years, in the late 1940s, before the social conventions of the peacetime beauty routine had fully solidified into the systematic requirements of the mid-decade, were making a more consciously deliberate choice than the women who would wear it as a matter of course by 1954. The wartime red had been a public statement. The transition period red was a declaration of intent, a signal that the wearer was choosing to carry the wartime's intentional self-presentation into the peacetime landscape, rather than retreating into the kind of casual informality that the end of sustained communal emergency sometimes releases. The women who maintained their red lips through the late 40s were, in a sense, refusing the informality. They were insisting on the continuation of the seriousness that the war years had lent to the act of presenting oneself carefully in public. By 1954, that choice had been institutionalized. The red lip was no longer a statement, it was a standard, and the specific shades available to execute that standard had multiplied in an extraordinary commercial proliferation that reflected the decade's broader consumer abundance. Revlon alone had, by the mid-1950s, a lipstick range numbering in the dozens of shades, all of them named with the particular marketing poetry that Charles Revson had identified as one of the primary levers of cosmetics desire. Persian melon, bachelor's carnation, love that pink, cherries in the snow. These were not simply shade names. They were micro-narratives, small compressed stories about the kind of woman who might wear them and the kind of moment she might be wearing them in. And the women who stood at the cosmetics counter and read them were reading not just shades but aspirations, selecting not just a color but a version of themselves that they were choosing to perform for the day or the evening or the occasion ahead. The social consequence of appearing without this final element of the 1954 presentation was, by the middle of the decade, of a different character than the consequences of any of the other omissions we have examined in this compilation. The cold cream skipped had consequences for the skin. The liner skipped had consequences for the social reading of the face. The pin curls skipped had consequences for the neighborhood's assessment of one's domestic management. But the lipstick skipped had consequences for something more fundamental, for the assessment of one's basic competence in the social role that one occupied. The lipstick was not the most technically demanding element of the beauty routine. It was the most symbolically loaded one. A woman without her lipstick in 1954 was a woman who had not finished. And a woman who had not finished was a woman who was, in some essential way, not yet fully present. Charles of the Ritz and Dorothy Gray were among the mid-market brands whose lipstick formulations competed seriously with Revlon and Hazel Bishop in the 1954 market, and their specific contributions to the red lip landscape of the decade deserve acknowledgement. Charles of the Ritz, with its slightly more refined positioning and its Revenescent skincare line that had established it as a brand associated with cosmetic intelligence rather than just cosmetic fashion, offered a red lipstick range that emphasized the quality of the pigment and the longevity of the wear over the marketing drama of the shade name. Dorothy Gray's lipsticks were known in the trade for their particularly smooth application, a formula characteristic that the women who loved them described in exactly the terms that contemporary lipstick reviewers use online today, which is a reminder that the specific pleasures of a well-made lipstick formula are not culturally contingent. A lipstick that goes on smoothly and stays true has always been a lipstick that its wearer recommends to her friends. The beauty routine of 1954 was not simply about what happened to your face if you skipped it. It was about what happened to your sense of self, your social standing, and your daily relationship to the world you inhabited. Skip the cold cream, and the city's toxins accumulated on your skin. Skip the liner, and the room registered your absence before you had spoken a word. Skip the lipstick, and the credential was missing. The signal was incomplete. The sentence had no final punctuation. The routine was not the cage. The routine was the armor. And the women who wore it, morning after morning after morning, in the post-war decade that had given them so much, and demanded in return a precision of self-presentation that was genuinely extraordinary. Those women were not performing femininity. They were practicing it. And the distance between those two verbs is the whole story.